I've seen pictures of my great-great-grandmother Easter Nelson, who was a slave but lived during the time period when the Emancipation Proclamation took place. Great-great-grandma Easter, wouldn't know, but her great-great-great-grandson would go on to graduate from the University of Virginia, which at her time, obviously, blacks couldn't attend. We have to be honest about slavery. We have to be honest about racism and how evil it was. But at the same time, I think that we have to be honest about people who have overcome. I was born in 1968. It was the year in April where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and grew up primarily in Northern Virginia. I don't even think that there was a traffic light in the town.
It sounds like it was a very close-knit family.
Growing up, we were a close-knit family. Even before church, we would have Bible study at home and scripture memorization. This church, Salem Baptist Church, is the church that I grew up in this small town of Marshall. Even though I was raised with family members and my parents that instilled in us the idea that we wanted to treat everybody the same, we knew that there was racism that went on. I'm remembering now one episode where I ran track at the junior high school, and after winning a 100-yard dash, I remember coming off of the track and my dad saying to me, "Hey, did you hear what that lady said?" And I said, "No, what was that?" He said, "Did you hear she said to her son, 'You let that nigger beat you'?" And I was like, "No, I didn't hear that at all." But it was a reminder to me, one, that there was racism that went on, but two, it was a reminder to me that my parents taught us not to be overly impacted by conditions of racism that might have been around us. What I remember more is never ever hearing my parents or my grandparents ever say a negative word about a white person. Despite the fact that my parents went to a segregated high school, not far from here is a small school that's just called Number 18 School. They had racism, there was segregation, but they more often emphasized to us about the opportunities that we had rather than emphasizing the challenges that were around us.
At the time that I grew up in Marshall area, it was a time of discrimination and also a time of segregation at the same time. There were several times when I was, had friends that were white, but we couldn't go to the same place to eat. A lot of times we were actually told that we couldn't go together, that sometimes the whites would want to go with us to the black side and vice versa, and they would quickly tell us that that's not the way it is, that it's just got to be separate,
There was a restaurant actually in our town, even in the 80s, that didn't welcome African Americans to eat at that restaurant. And most of us knew, Roy McCoy had this restaurant, but who wants to eat at a restaurant where you're not wanted?
Are you angry about America's past of slavery and segregation, or were you at one point?
Growing up as a kid, I didn't have anger, but when I was in college, I think being exposed to certain ideas and worldviews, there was a point where I was angry that there were things that were not told to me, hidden stories, listening to some of the pain of people. I went my first year of college to Howard University, kind of like the Mecca, as an African American student. I do remember my worldview beginning to shift a little bit, being enlightened, so to speak, about what white people had done. And I even remember coming back to Marshall, looking differently at white people, thinking that I was now better than them because of what they had done. I think when you're young, you're experimenting. You have a lot of ideas, and there were people from that time period that were radical about our outlook on life and wanting to make a change, but coming to realize that sometimes the change that you think that you might want really isn't the change that ultimately can help sustain society.
Today, I think a lot of Americans are struggling with America's past of slavery and the battle for civil rights, and they're now asking a lot of hard questions about America's past. How have you processed through America's dark past?
Growing up, I never knew that there was a Virginian by the name of Robert Carter. Because of a religious conversion, Robert Carter overcame slavery by emancipating 500 slaves during his lifetime. So those are examples to me that should be told in our history, not to sugarcoat the realities of racism, but to look and to see that the human spirit, particularly people of faith, have embraced their better angels, so to speak, and overcome that. But I think it's important for me to look back at people like Frederick Douglass. He was the most photographed person in the 19th century. And that sparked my interest about Frederick Douglass from an early childhood. He escaped from slavery from Maryland with the help of the woman that would ultimately be his wife, Anna Douglass. And they would escape to the north and ultimately would be involved in the abolitionist movement when William Lloyd Garrison heard the testimony of somebody who could actually read and write, and as a slave, he put Frederick Douglass on the stump, and Douglass began to gain more popularity throughout his lifetime, and ultimately would become the owner of his own newspaper and would become the great abolitionist and statesman that we all know today.
And what do you think he's really taught you? What's really a lesson you've taken from his speeches and his readings and writings?
Frederick Douglass, as a person of faith, didn't just talk about his faith, but literally being able to forgive his slave master for enslaving him was, to me, the most profound act of forgiveness that could be done. I believe for any culture to be able to move forward, there has to be an element of forgiveness. Forgiveness means, number one, acknowledging that there's something that is wrong that took place. And I think that the message of forgiveness is healthy for an individual to be able to forgive, because if you don't, you'll hold and harbor those resentments, and it's only going to hurt you ultimately in the long run. But again, fast forward, particularly as a Christian and as a minister of the gospel, the message of the gospel is empowering, and that was the message that empowered Frederick Douglass. That was the message that empowered my great-great-grandma Easter. And I think that that is the message at the Frederick Douglass Foundation that we encourage people to embrace today. It is a message of not forgetting about the sin of slavery, not sugarcoating the truth, but it is a message that you can acknowledge the past, but we can also acknowledge how bright our future can be if we're willing to forgive, and if we're willing to embrace a better future for tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much. I'm not going to try to pull this microphone out here, but I do want to shake your hand. So. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, man. It's a pleasure.